The Persian scouts came back with a report that stopped the most powerful king in the world cold. Not that the Greeks had fortified their position, not that reinforcements had arrived. The scouts reported that the soldiers blocking the pass, the men standing between Xerxes and the conquest of all Greece, were combing their hair, grooming their long hair, doing calisthenics, exercising with a calm so absolute it looked like contempt. Before them stood the largest army the ancient world had assembled. Modern historians estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 120,000 and 300,000 warriors. So vast that Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled the war, placed the number in the millions. Even the most conservative scholarly estimate represents odds of roughly 20 to 1, and the men at the wall were combing their hair. For 3 days, that army could not advance a single step. But here is what historians have never fully answered. Why did Leonidas stay? He knew the mountain path existed. He had posted guards on it. He had 3 separate warnings before dawn on the final day. His seer read it in the sacrificial animals. Deserters confirmed it in the dark. Scouts ran it down from the heights at first light. He had time to retreat. And he was a king, not an anonymous volunteer. His death would mean something to Sparta that no soldier's death could. He dismissed most of his army. He kept 300 men. Herodotus gives us 2 explanations and believes neither is complete. Something drove that decision that the chronicles hint at but never name. You will discover the rehearsed military tactic the Spartans executed multiple times across 2 days of combat, drawing the finest troops in the Persian Empire into a trap and destroying them, which the Immortals, the 10,000-strong royal elite who had never been defeated in open battle, fell for repeatedly, according to both Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus. You will discover the man Herodotus names the bravest Greek at Thermopylae. Not Leonidas, but a soldier named Leonidas, who laughed when told that Persian arrows would darken the sun and said they would fight in the shade, then died in the exact darkness he had mocked. And you will discover what happened to Leonidas's body after the battle, and why, 40 years later, Sparta sent men back to retrieve it. And to understand why a king who had every tactical reason to live chose instead to die, we need to go back to the spring of 481 BC, and the moment a congress of rival city-states made a decision that would shape the next 2,500 years. 10 years before Thermopylae, on a coastal plain northeast of Athens, the Persian Empire suffered something it had almost no experience with, a defeat that couldn't be explained away. The first Persian invasion had been, by any measure, a punitive expedition. King Darius I, ruler of an empire stretching from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean, the largest empire the world had yet seen, sent a force across the Aegean to punish Athens and Eretria for supporting the Ionian Greek revolt against Persian rule. The Persian military had crushed kingdoms from Egypt to Bactria, a collection of quarreling Greek city-states led by a mid-sized democracy whose primary distinction was a novel system of self-governance, should not have presented a serious problem. At Marathon in 490 BC, the Athenians and their Plataean allies destroyed the expedition. Herodotus records Persian losses at 6,400 killed. Athenian losses, 192. The Persian army, ordered to take the Greeks alive, fled to its ships instead. It was the kind of outcome that a great empire cannot simply file away and forget. The record had been broken in a way that demanded correction. Darius died in 486 BC before he could mount the correction himself. He left to his son the twin inheritance of the throne and an unfinished war. That son was Xerxes I, and understanding what drove him to Thermopylae requires understanding something important about the man. He did not particularly want to invade Greece. Herodotus records that Xerxes initially favored a more cautious policy. He was persuaded toward the Greek campaign primarily by his cousin and brother-in-law, Mardonius, who, as Herodotus notes, had personal ambitions. Specifically, he wanted to become governor of Greece once it was conquered. Mardonius argued for the campaign vigorously and eventually prevailed. Xerxes, whom Herodotus describes as capable of both generous magnanimity and extreme severity, threw himself into the preparations with characteristic absolutism once the decision was made. But those preparations were unprecedented in ancient logistics. For 3 years, from 484 to 481 BC, the Persian military machine assembled a force from 46 subject nations. 2 pontoon bridges were constructed across the Hellespont. 360 ships lashed together for the northeasterly span, 314 for the southwesterly one, creating a crossing that an army could march over as though on solid ground. A canal was dug through the isthmus of Mount Athos, through solid rock and earth, by forced labor working across 3 years. Supply depots were established across Thrace along the planned march route. Herodotus notes that nothing like this preparation had ever been undertaken. When a storm destroyed the first bridge before the army crossed, and Xerxes' response revealed something essential about the man and the empire he embodied. Herodotus records that he ordered the Hellespont itself punished. 300 lashes delivered to the sea, iron shackles dropped into the water as a symbol of its enslavement to the King of Kings. Whether this was performed literally or as ritual theater, its message was unambiguous. Not even nature could defy him. The army assembled at Sardis in the spring of 480 BC and began its march. Region after region sent tokens of submission, earth and water, the traditional symbols of surrender to Persian authority. Thessaly submitted. Much of Boeotia submitted. The empire that had never quite recovered from Marathon was coming back, and this time it had brought everything. And what it had not accounted for was a narrow strip of coast in central Greece, where the mountains pressed almost to the sea, and a Spartan king who had already read his own death in the oracle's words. Greece, in 481 BC, was not a nation. It was a collection of several hundred independent city-states, many of which had been at war with each other within living memory. Athens and Corinth had commercial rivalries. Sparta and Argos had deep mutual suspicion. Thebes and Athens had fought within decades. The very concept of Greece as a unified political entity was almost entirely fictional. What made the Persian threat different was its scale. When Xerxes sent ambassadors demanding earth and water, the traditional tokens of submission, to the Greek cities, he conspicuously skipped Athens and Sparta. This was deliberate, and the Athenians had thrown previous Persian ambassadors into a pit. The Spartans had thrown theirs into a well. Both cities had made their position clear in the most emphatic manner available. In the autumn of 481 BC, a congress assembled at the Isthmus of Corinth. Approximately 30 city-states, representing a fraction of all Greek poleis, but including the most militarily significant, agreed to a formal alliance. The Hellenic League, as it became known, placed Sparta in command of land forces and Athens in command of the fleet. This was remarkable, not because the arrangement was smooth, it wasn't, but because these particular rivals had managed to agree on anything at all. The first strategic debate concerned where to stand. An initial plan proposed holding the Vale of Tempe, a narrow passage in northern Thessaly, through which the Persian army would have to pass. 10,000 hoplites were dispatched to the position. They were warned there almost immediately by Alexander I of Macedon, who was nominally a Persian vassal, but was quietly playing both sides of the conflict. That Tempe could be outflanked through a parallel mountain route. and that the scale of the Persian force was beyond anything the Greeks had yet appreciated. The force at Tempe withdrew without fighting. The northern approach to Greece was open. The second strategic plan came from Themistocles of Athens, arguably the most clear-sighted mind involved in the entire campaign. His proposal was a coordinated two-point defense. A small land force would block the coastal pass of Thermopylae, the primary road through central Greece, and while the Greek fleet simultaneously held the Straits of Artemisium to the northeast. The two positions were mutually dependent. If the fleet broke at Artemisium, Persian ships could land troops behind the land position. If Thermopylae fell, the fleet at Artemisium became irrelevant. Both defenses had to hold, or both would fail. The choice of Thermopylae itself was the genius of the plan. The pass, the Hot Gates, named for the sulfur springs that steamed along its base, was where the Kallidromos mountain range pressed almost to the shore of the Malian Gulf. Herodotus understood what made it tactically decisive. In open terrain, Persian doctrine was devastating. Massed archers suppressing the enemy, followed by cavalry charges on the flanks and mass infantry in the center. The Persians had used this combination to conquer everything from the Nile Delta to the borders of India. At Thermopylae, none of it applied. The pass was too narrow for cavalry to deploy. The cliffs prevented flanking. The archers would have to fire straight into a wall of overlapping bronze shields. In open terrain, 120,000 warriors against 7,000 Greeks was a slaughter. In a 20-meter pass, it was something else entirely. What Themistocles' plan required, however, was a commander willing to take a position that everyone understood might be suicidal, and hold it long enough to matter. The Congress turned to Sparta. Sparta turned to its king. He was approximately 60 years old when he led 300 men to Thermopylae. This is the detail that popular history almost always loses, and losing it changes the story fundamentally. Leonidas was not a young warrior seeking glory. He was a man of late middle age who had spent more than 5 decades in a society whose entire purpose was producing people exactly like him, and who had read, in the Delphic oracle's prophecy, what his choice at Thermopylae was going to cost. Leonidas I was the 17th king of the Aegeid dynasty, a Spartan royal house that traced its lineage, at least in legend, to the hero Heracles. He was born around 540 BC, the third son of King Anaxandridas II. Because he was not the firstborn son, he was not exempt from the agoge, the state-controlled education and training system that Spartan society used to transform boys into warriors. Future heirs were typically exempted. Leonidas was not an heir. He went through the full program, and the agoge began at 7 years old. Boys were taken from their families and placed in communal barracks. They were given inadequate food, not accidentally, but as training in endurance and resourcefulness. They ran barefoot regardless of season. They were grouped into bands, taught to fight each other, and evaluated constantly for the qualities Sparta valued: courage, physical endurance, tactical intelligence, and absolute loyalty to the group. This lasted 13 years. By 20, Leonidas had earned full citizenship as a homoios, an equal, the highest status available to a Spartan male, through demonstrated merit rather than birthright. He then spent the rest of his adult life, even as king, eating in communal military messes and maintaining the physical readiness the society demanded of every warrior citizen. He became king around 490 BC, the same year as Marathon, when his older half-brother Cleomenes I died under violent and somewhat mysterious circumstances without a male heir. Leonidas married Cleomenes' daughter Gorgo, his half-niece, and took the throne at an age when most men in the ancient world were already considered old. He had been king for approximately 10 years before Thermopylae. Paul Cartledge, one of the leading modern authorities on Spartan history, has argued that the Hellenic League chose Leonidas specifically for personal capability rather than merely Spartan prestige. The coalition had reason for this judgment. They wanted someone who could hold a position under impossible pressure, maintain discipline among contingents from a dozen different city-states with different fighting traditions, and make clear-eyed decisions when the situation deteriorated. The record of Leonidas's command at Thermopylae suggests they were right. The selection of the 300 deserves attention. Herodotus states directly that Leonidas chose only men who had already produced male heirs. This was not ceremonial. It was a specific requirement, and it tells us something important. Leonidas understood, or strongly suspected, that this force was not coming back. The Delphic oracle had told the Spartans that either their city would be destroyed or their king would die. Leonidas, according to Herodotus' assessment, had concluded which outcome he was choosing. He marched out of Sparta with 300 men who had sons to carry their names forward. Then what waited for him in the mountain pass was a question no amount of training fully answers. How do you lead men into a place you know is a death trap? The records don't tell us. What they tell us is that he did it, and that 7,000 Greeks followed him north. On the shore of the Hellespont, watching his army cross the bridge he had built across an entire strait, Xerxes I wept. Herodotus records the moment. Xerxes looked at the vast host streaming across the water. Warriors from every nation his empire had absorbed. The largest army that had ever marched under a single commander's authority. And wept at the thought of how many of them would be dead within 100 years. The anecdote, whether literally true or not, reveals something genuine about how ancient sources understood this king. A man capable of grandeur and genuine feeling, but also of the kind of cruelty that comes when absolute power is exercised without consistent restraint. Xerxes I was born around 519 BC, the son of Darius the Great and Atossa, who was herself the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. He was the first son born after Darius's accession to the throne, which made him the designated heir over older half-brothers. His title was Shahanshah, King of Kings, and it was not hyperbole. He ruled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean, encompassing Egypt, Babylon, Anatolia, Thrace, and dozens of other territories. The subjugated peoples of this empire funded his army, supplied his soldiers, and built his monuments. The ancient Greek sources, inevitably, are not kind to him. Aeschylus staged a play called The Persians just 8 years after Thermopylae, within living memory of veterans who had fought in it, and portrayed Xerxes as consumed by hubris, destroyed by his own overreach. Herodotus's portrait is more nuanced. He describes a man capable of both thoughtful planning and reckless impulse, who was initially reluctant to invade Greece and was talked into it by Mardonius's arguments, but who then committed to the campaign with the total resources of the world's largest empire. Modern historians, including Pierre Briand, have noted that the Greek sources present a stereotyped and biased portrait, and that Xerxes was in other respects an effective administrator and builder. What the ancient sources agree on, Persian, Greek, and subsequent, is the scale of what he assembled. Among the force were the Immortals, an elite corps of 10,000 warriors who served as the royal guard and the empire's premier shock troops. Their name derived from the practice of immediate replacement. When an immortal fell, a successor was promoted instantly to maintain the number at exactly 10,000. They were better equipped than standard Persian infantry, carrying longer spears and wearing scale armor that provided genuine protection. Their reputation had been built across decades of campaigning. No force they had faced had withstood them in open battle. Beyond the Immortals, the Persian host included Medes and Scythians, Assyrians, Scythians, Ethiopians from the Upper Nile, Bactrians with cane bows, Indian contingents in cotton armor. Herodotus catalogues them with the evident fascination of a man trying to convey the sheer improbability of so many different peoples marching under a single authority. The diversity was deliberate. Xerxes wanted the march to be a visible demonstration of how much of the world he controlled. When the first pontoon bridge was destroyed by a storm before the crossing began, Xerxes did not rebuild it and move on. He ordered the Hellespont punished, 300 lashes delivered to the water, iron shackles dropped into the strait to symbolize its enslavement to his will. Whether this was literal or ceremonial, it was a statement about the kind of authority he claimed. Nature itself was subject to the King of Kings, an exiled Spartan king named Demaratus, serving in Xerxes' court as an advisor after being deposed from his own throne, tried to explain what waited at Thermopylae. The Spartans, he told Xerxes, would not retreat and would not surrender. They were the finest fighters in the world, and they fought not under compulsion or for reward, but for their law, and their law did not permit retreat. Herodotus records that Xerxes found this amusing. He would not find it amusing for long. Two military philosophies had evolved independently on opposite sides of the Aegean, and Thermopylae was where they would discover that one worked in a mountain pass and one did not. Persian warfare, refined across 2 centuries of imperial expansion, was built on a principle of overwhelming firepower followed by mass. The sequence was almost algorithmic. Advance to range, release massed volleys of composite bow arrows to suppress the enemy and create casualties. You then send infantry forward against a disorganized and demoralized opponent, with cavalry exploiting the flanks and finishing the pursuit. This combination had broken armies from Egypt to Bactria. It worked because it required space, room for archers to maintain distance, room for cavalry to maneuver, room for the sheer mass of Persian infantry to make its weight felt across a broad front. The standard Persian infantryman carried a wicker shield called a garan, wore light scale armor or padded linen, and was armed with a short spear and a dagger. The equipment prioritized mobility over protection. This was sensible when your doctrine assumed the enemy would be broken by archery before they reached you. It became a liability when the enemy reached you first. The Immortals were better equipped, longer spears, heavier armor, composite bows they could use in a firefight if needed. They were the best troops Persia had. Even they had a specific weakness. Their spears were shorter than the Greek dory. The Greek hoplite existed to fight exactly the kind of battle Persian doctrine was designed to avoid: close, grinding, face-to-face combat, where individual equipment and unit cohesion determined survival. Every major city-state trained its male citizens in hoplite warfare from young adulthood. The equipment was standardized to a degree that no Persian composite army could match. A bronze Corinthian or Chalcidian helmet protecting the entire head and face. The hoplon, a large round bronze-faced shield approximately 1 meter in diameter. The dory, a spear running between 2.5 and nearly 3 meters long. A short xiphos sword for close work, a bronze armor for the torso, bronze greaves for the legs. Each hoplite carried approximately 30 to 35 kilograms of equipment. They were walking fortresses. In a phalanx formation, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward in rows. A line of hoplites presented an essentially impenetrable surface to frontal assault. The bronze shields shed arrows that Persian archery, at combat range, didn't have the power to punch through. The dory spear reached Persian warriors before Persian spears could reach the Greek line. And the discipline required to maintain the phalanx under pressure was exactly what the agoge and equivalent training in other city-states had been producing for generations. The mathematics of the pass made all of this decisive. Herodotus's ancient estimates and modern scholarly analysis both agree that the middle gate, the primary Greek fighting position, was under 100 meters wide in the fighting zone, with at least one choke point so narrow that ancient sources describe it as barely wide enough for a single wagon. You cannot bring 300,000 warriors to bear on a front that narrow. You can send them forward in rows of perhaps dozens at a time, and those rows will face a phalanx at maximum effectiveness, protected by terrain from the archery and cavalry that made Persian doctrine work everywhere else. Military historians analyzing Thermopylae note that the Greeks did not just exploit the terrain. They had selected it precisely because it would convert Persian tactical advantages into irrelevance. The feigned retreat, rehearsed, disciplined, and executed with the mechanical precision of men who had trained for it since childhood, would add another dimension. But the foundation of everything was simpler than that. The Greeks had found the one place in Greece where 300,000 men couldn't fight like 300,000 men. What you see at Thermopylae today is not what Leonidas saw. It is not even close. The shoreline has advanced as much as 9 kilometers since 480 BC. Driven by alluvial deposits from the Spercheios River and travertine buildup from the hot springs themselves. The actual ground on which the battle was fought now lies approximately 20 meters below the surface, buried under 2.5 millennia of accumulated sediment. Where the pass once pressed cliffs against sea so tightly that an army could barely squeeze through, a wide agricultural plain now stretches to the water. The modern motorway connecting Athens and Thessaloniki follows the ancient shoreline. Tourists drive through the battle site without knowing what is beneath them. In 480 BC, the pass was 3 narrow constrictions, 3 gates, separated by somewhat wider ground. The western gate was the Persian entry point. The eastern gate at Alpinus, where Greek supply lines terminated, was the exit into Locris. Between them was the middle gate, the primary Greek fighting position, where the mountain pressed hardest against the sea. Here, the fighting zone was under 100 meters at its widest. Though ancient sources suggest the absolute narrowest point may have been tight enough for little more than a single wagon. It was at the middle gate that an earlier Phocian war had produced a defensive wall across the pass. Leonidas had his forces repair it when they arrived. The thermal springs that gave the pass its name, Thermopylae, means hot gates, still flow today, slightly inland from the ancient shoreline. In 480 BC, they would have flooded the ground at the base of the cliffs and created a steaming, sulfurous atmosphere along the fighting zone. The heat of late August in central Greece, compounded by the springs and the press of thousands of armed men in bronze armor, would have made the air almost unbreathable. This is the sensory reality that ancient sources don't dwell on, but that every soldier present would have been acutely aware of. Behind the main position, 3 hills provided elevated ground for observation and supporting archery. The Kolonos Hill, a small rise behind the wall, would become significant on the final day in a way that archaeology has since confirmed. The Anapaea path was the pass's fatal vulnerability, and Leonidas knew it. This was a goat track winding approximately 19 kilometers along the mountain ridge above the pass, navigable by infantry, emerging behind the Greek position near the eastern gate at Alpinus. The path ran through dense oak forest, a detail that would prove surprisingly consequential. Leonidas dispatched 1,000 Phocian troops to guard the heights. The choice of Phocians was practical. They knew the local terrain. What he could not control was what would happen when they encountered a Persian force in the dark. The Kolonos Hill's significance was established definitively not in antiquity, but in 1939, when the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavating the site. What he found was bronze, hundreds of Persian arrowheads of the trilobate type, concentrated on the hill's surface. Physical evidence of an event that Herodotus had described with a phrase that would resonate across centuries. The last Greeks at Thermopylae fought with their hands and their teeth until Persian archers ended it from a distance. The ground beneath the modern fields remembers what happened there. The arrowheads are still in it, as the Persian vanguard reached Thermopylae to find the Greeks already in position. Xerxes' army arrived and deployed, an operation that must itself have taken considerable time, and then waited. Herodotus records 4 days of complete inaction. What the Persian scouts observed during those 4 days, and what they reported back, created one of the strangest moments in the entire pre-battle record. The scouts returned with a description that, to Persian sensibilities, was deeply disorienting. The Spartans at the Phocian wall were exercising, doing calisthenics. More strikingly, and Herodotus records this with evident awareness of how strange it must have seemed, they were grooming their long hair, combing it, arranging it, treating it with the care of men preparing for a festival rather than a battle. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, Ephialtes was baffled by the report. He called in Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king serving in his court. Demaratus had warned Xerxes before the campaign that the Greeks would fight and that Sparta was the most dangerous of all. Now Xerxes demanded an explanation for the grooming. Demaratus's answer has survived 2,500 years. This is their custom. Whenever they are about to risk their lives, they dress their hair. He told Xerxes, with an urgency Herodotus conveys clearly, that these men would not retreat. They were not there to negotiate or delay. They were obeying their law, and their law said they stood until they could not stand. Herodotus records that Xerxes found this explanation difficult to believe. He expected the sight of his army to dissolve Greek, resolve the way morning fog dissolves in sunlight. He waited 4 days for this to happen. It did not. The psychological dynamic of those 4 days deserves recognition. Xerxes intended the wait as pressure, a demonstration that he was in no hurry, that the Greeks were simply waiting for a destruction that could come whenever he chose. What it produced instead was the opposite. 4 days of watching 7,000 Greeks who showed no fear, who combed their hair and exercised and went about their preparations as though the largest army in the world was an inconvenience rather than an existential threat. The psychological advantage shifted quietly during those days. Before the assault began, Xerxes sent a final demand. The Greeks should lay down their arms. The reply attributed to Leonidas by the historical tradition. 2 words, molon lebe, meaning come and take them, captures something real about the Spartan attitude, regardless of whether this precise formulation is the exact phrasing used. Herodotus documents the exchange. Plutarch, writing 6 centuries later, provides the specific Greek phrase. What is not disputed is that the demand was refused. The refusal was delivered with characteristic Spartan brevity, and what followed on the 5th day was the end of any negotiating. On the 5th day, Xerxes gave the order. The Medes went forward first. The first attack came from warriors who had personal reason for fury. Herodotus specifies that Xerxes sent the Medes and Scythians forward first, and specifies why. These contingents included men whose kinsmen had fallen at Marathon, when the defeat of the first Persian invasion was not a political abstraction for these soldiers. It was a family wound. They went into the pass carrying genuine grievance alongside their spears and wicker shields. The middle gate destroyed their advantage immediately. The pass narrowed their formation from a front of tens of thousands to dozens. The hoplites at the wall presented overlapping bronze shields at a height and width, calibrated for exactly this kind of frontal engagement. The Persian dory, shorter than the Greek equivalent, could not reach Greek warriors before Greek spears reached Persians. The wicker Gerons shields, adequate against the arrow exchanges and light cavalry engagements that Persian doctrine typically produced, they were insufficient against the thrust of a heavy Greek spear pressed by 35 kilograms of armored bodyweight behind it. The Medes crashed into the phalanx. The phalanx held. Wave followed wave. Persian officers, Herodotus implies, drove men forward with whips, an image that says something important about the difference between the two armies. The Spartans and their allies were in that pass by choice, under law, holding a position they had selected for strategic reasons. The men being whipped forward had neither the choice of terrain nor the motivation of free citizens defending their own land. They had the numbers. They did not have the will that numbers cannot replace. The Greeks rotated. As one contingent tired, fresh troops moved to the front line. The Medes pressed forward continuously over their own dead and encountered fresh opposition each time. Herodotus notes the battle was sustained across a long engagement before the Medes were finally able to withdraw. Their losses were substantial. Then, Herodotus records, the Spartans executed what is perhaps the most tactically sophisticated maneuver documented from the entire battle: the feigned retreat. The Spartan line broke, or appeared to. Warriors who had been holding the wall turned and ran, seemingly in panic or exhaustion, drawing Persian troops forward in pursuit into the narrowest section of the pass, where they bunched together and lost the loose formation that even their light infantry tactics required. At a signal, the Spartans wheeled. The phalanx reformed with the mechanical precision of men who had rehearsed this exact maneuver since adolescence. The pursuing Persians, disorganized and in close ground, were cut down. Herodotus documents this tactic explicitly, and Diodorus Siculus, writing independently from Herodotus, records the same maneuver. Both ancient sources agree. The feigned retreat was deployed multiple times, and it worked every time. Day one of combat ended with the Medes broken and the line still standing. Xerxes made his next decision. If ordinary troops couldn't break the phalanx, he would send the force that had never failed. He committed the Immortals. 10,000 warriors who had never been defeated marched into a 20-meter pass and discovered that reputation is not armor. The Immortals were the finest military unit the Achaemenid Empire possessed, as they had maintained their number at exactly 10,000 through decades of campaigning precisely because fallen soldiers were replaced instantly. The point being that the unit itself was permanent, even if the individuals within it were not. Their equipment was superior to standard Persian infantry. Their training was rigorous. Their record was unblemished. They were the weapon Xerxes deployed when ordinary force had failed. In the pass at Thermopylae, none of that mattered. Herodotus records the result with an economy of language that makes it hit harder than elaboration would. The Immortals failed to make any headway against the Greeks. The phalanx that had broken the Medes broke the Immortals too. The feigned retreat was deployed against the finest troops in Asia, and the finest troops in Asia pursued, and the phalanx reformed, and the finest troops in Asia died in a narrow passage that negated everything that made them fine. Diodorus Siculus corroborates this account independently. It was at some point during this first day's fighting, after the Medes had failed and the Immortals had failed and the wall still stood, that Xerxes, watching from his throne on elevated ground above the pass, leaped to his feet 3 times in agitation. Herodotus records this detail with the precision of a man who understood its significance. The king of kings, surrounded by the visible manifestation of his empire's power, watching that power break against a line of men who should have broken long ago. It was also before this day's fighting, in the period of waiting, that the man Herodotus would record as the bravest Greek at Thermopylae made the remark that has outlasted the battle, the empire, the language in which it was first spoken, and most of the events of the following 2,500 years. A local Trachinian, perhaps trying to be helpful, perhaps not fully appreciating his audience, informed a Spartan soldier named Leonidas that the Persian archers were so numerous that their arrows would block out the sun. Dionysius's reply, documented in Herodotus's histories at 7.226, was immediate. Good. Then we shall fight in the shade. Herodotus names him the bravest of all the 300. He died on the 3rd day. He never got to fight in the shade. His words lasted longer than the empire that killed him. Day 1 ended. The Greek line was intact, and the Immortals had failed. The largest army in the world had spent an entire day attacking a mountain pass and accomplished nothing except the production of bodies. Xerxes withdrew to his camp. Herodotus records him as totally perplexed. Across the pass, the Greeks dressed their wounds and rotated their tired men and prepared for the morning. Xerxes sent fresh assault waves on the 2nd day on a specific assumption. Herodotus preserves the reasoning exactly. The Persian king believed the Greeks, being so few, were now disabled by wounds and could no longer resist. He was wrong. The rotation system had kept the Greek defensive line at near full effectiveness throughout the first day's fighting. Fresh contingents had been moving to the front continuously. Exhausted warriors had rested, eaten, tended their wounds, and returned. On the 2nd day found the phalanx in better condition than Persian intelligence assumed, and the pass in exactly the same physical configuration that had negated every Persian advantage the day before. Wave after wave of Persian infantry went into the narrow ground and came back with nothing. Herodotus's account of the 2nd day is notable for how little it adds to the first. This is itself the point. The fighting was essentially identical in outcome. Sustained combat, Greek line holding, Persian casualties mounting, 0 territorial gain. The monotony of failure is its own form of documentation. By late afternoon of the 2nd day, Xerxes stopped the assault again and withdrew to his camp. Herodotus's word for his state of mind is precise. Totally perplexed. The same phrase he used the night before. The strategic pressure on the Persian command was real, even if the ancient sources don't enumerate it in logistical terms. Historians studying ancient military operations note that Xerxes had established supply depots along his march route, specifically because feeding an army of this size was a constant operational challenge. Herodotus documents these preparations at Book 7, Chapter 25. A stationary army was an expensive army. The longer the force remained before an unconquered pass, the more the supply lines strained, and the more the psychological momentum of the campaign stalled. He had to go forward. The pass made going forward impossible. Something had to change. On the evening of the 2nd day, something did. A man walked toward the Persian camp from the direction of the local hills. Herodotus identifies him precisely. Ephialtes, son of Eurydemus, a Greek from Trachis in the region of Malis. He had information he wanted to sell. He approached Xerxes' command, Herodotus states, because he wanted a great reward. There was no ideology in it. no religious commitment, no long-standing grievance that drove him to the Persian camp. He wanted money, and he had something worth paying for. His name entered the Greek language permanently. The modern Greek word for nightmare is still Ephialtes. Ephialtes told Xerxes about the path above the pass. The Oenopeia was a goat track running approximately 19 kilometers along the mountain ridge above Thermopylae, threading through dense oak forest, descending finally near the eastern gate at Alpinus, behind the Greek position. Leonidas had known it existed. He had posted 1,000 Phocian troops there specifically because he recognized it as the fatal vulnerability of the entire defensive plan. If that path was blocked, Thermopylae could hold as long as the Greeks had men to hold it. If it wasn't blocked, everything else was irrelevant. Herodotus records that Xerxes sent Hydarnes, a prominent Persian commander, with his force along the path that evening, guided by Ephialtes. The path wound through oak forest that, in the late summer heat, still held its leaves. This muffled sound in a way that autumn would not have, a small seasonal detail that would later become important. Hydarnes' force marched through the night. At some point before dawn, ascending through the oak trees on the ridge, their boots made a sound on the ground, enough sound to alert the Phocians guarding the heights. Herodotus records the moment with the specificity of a man using a source who was there or close to it. The Phocians jumped up and began to put on their arms. The Persians, suddenly confronted with an armed force in the dark, paused. Hydarnes feared they might be Spartans. Ephialtes reassured him they were Phocians. Hydarnes arrayed his force for battle. The Phocians, suddenly facing what appeared to be a major assault force in darkness on unfamiliar high ground, made the decision that would end the battle. They retreated to a nearby peak, believing they were the primary Persian target and intending to make their stand there. Modern historians have generally resisted calling this cowardice. The Phocians faced overwhelming numbers in poor conditions and made a militarily defensible judgment. And the tragedy, and it was a tragedy, is that their reasonable decision left the path open. The Persian column moved past them and descended toward the rear of the Greek position. Herodotus also records a competing tradition about who revealed the path, an account naming two other men, Leonidas and Corydallos, rather than Ephialtes. He explicitly rejects this version, noting that the Greeks themselves issued a bounty specifically for Ephialtes by name, suggesting they had reliable information about who was responsible. Ephialtes survived the battle, living in Greece apparently under the assumption that he was safe. The Greeks eventually offered a reward for his death. He was killed by a man named Leonidas of Trachis, for reasons unrelated to the betrayal. But the Greeks awarded the bounty anyway. And as for Ephialtes himself, he walked to the Persian camp for money, bought his name into the Greek language as a synonym for nightmare, and then lived under that judgment until someone with a personal grudge resolved the matter. History preserved the act. It did not preserve whatever he told himself about it. Below in the pass, Leonidas had not yet been told. That would change before dawn. 3 warnings reached the Greek position before the sun rose on the 3rd day, and they arrived in sequence. The first came from Megistius, the seer who had accompanied the army from Acarnania. Herodotus records that Megistius examined the sacrificial victims that night and read in them that death was coming at dawn. This happened before any other intelligence arrived, before the deserters, before the scouts. Whether one accepts the mechanics of ancient divination or not, the historical fact is that Megistius declared, independently and first, that the morning would bring destruction. He then apparently spent the remaining hours of darkness making his peace with what he had read. The second warning came from deserters. Herodotus doesn't specify their origin, who slipped from the Persian camp while it was still dark and brought the news of the flanking march. The third came as dawn broke, when scouts who had been watching from the heights came running down to confirm what the deserters had reported. A Persian force was descending from the mountain behind them. Leonidas convened a council. The debate was genuine. Herodotus records that some urged that they should not desert their post, while others opposed this council. After the council broke up, most of the Greek contingents departed, some in organized withdrawal toward their home cities, some simply dispersing. Herodotus presents two explanations for this: that Leonidas dismissed them deliberately, preferring to preserve their lives for the larger Greek defense, or that the allies left of their own accord when the situation became clear. The historian inclines toward the former, and most modern scholars follow him. Three contingents remained. The 300 Spartans stayed because they had come understanding that retreat was not an option their law permitted when a king commanded them. This is documented. But what has received less attention is the decision of Demophilus, son of Diadromes, who commanded the 700 Thespians. Every hoplite the city of Thespiae could field. Herodotus names Demophilus specifically at 7.222. The Thespian situation was unique and brutal. Their city lay directly in the path of the Persian advance. Thespiae would be burned whether the battle was won or lost. Herodotus records at 8.50 that the Persians burned it specifically because its citizens had refused to submit. Every fighting man Thespiae possessed was standing in that pass. Demophilus and his 700 didn't stay because the law required it. They stayed because the alternative was to watch their city burn without them, and to a Thespian hoplite, that was no alternative at all. The 400 Thebans were retained by Leonidas. Herodotus implies partly as hostages, since Thebes had long been suspected of Persian sympathies, and the suspicion would prove correct. On the third day, when the situation became hopeless, the Thebans would surrender. Leonidas tried to send away Megistias, the seer, who had read his own death in the morning's sacrifice. Megistias refused to leave. He sent his son away, his only child, at Leonidas's direction, and stayed himself. The poet Simonides, Herodotus tells us, wrote Megistias's memorial epitaph not as a public commission, but as a personal act, for friendship's sake. It is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire account. A man who knew he was going to die, who sent his child to safety and stayed at a post where he would be no tactical use, commemorated afterward by a friend who could not let him be forgotten. Why did Leonidas stay? Herodotus gives two explanations and, unusually for him, declines to choose between them definitively. The oracle's prophecy was a factor, Sparta or its king, and Leonidas had chosen which. The practical military calculus was also real. The surviving Greeks needed time to withdraw before the Persian flanking force descended from the mountain, and a rearguard buys time with its life. Both explanations are true. Neither is complete. Somewhere in the intersection of duty, calculation, and something that doesn't have a name, a 60-year-old king decided to stay in a mountain pass and wait for the morning. Dawn broke. Xerxes made his libations. The Persian force descended from the ridge. What the surviving Greeks did on the third day violated every convention of defensive warfare. They attacked. Rather than holding the wall and waiting for the end to come to them, the remaining Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans moved forward out of the narrow middle gate into the wider part of the pass. Herodotus explains the tactical logic. which was, under the circumstances, ruthlessly clear. Fighting in wider ground meant they could kill more Persians before the encirclement was complete. They were going to die in the pass regardless. They chose to make their deaths as expensive as possible. The fighting that followed was of a different character from the first 2 days. The Greeks were no longer executing a defensive rotation designed to preserve the line indefinitely. They were attacking with what Herodotus calls a desperate valor, fully aware that the Immortals were descending from the mountain behind them, and that the only question remaining was how many Persians they could kill before that force arrived. The answer, Herodotus records, was substantial. Persian casualties in this final phase were severe. 2 of Xerxes' own brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes, were killed in this fighting. Herodotus records this at Book 8, Chapter 25. Men who shared the King of Kings' blood died in the wider ground of the hot gates on the 3rd morning. Leonidas was killed early in the final battle. His position, as king and commander, would have been at the front. Seeker Herodotus records what happened next with the specificity that suggests access to accounts from participants. The surviving Greeks fought over his body. They pushed the Persians back 4 times, successfully recovering the body of their king each time, fighting like men who know they are going to die and care about nothing except that their general is not dishonored. The body was secured. Then the Thebans made their calculation. As the Immortals appeared from behind and the situation became unambiguously fatal, the Theban contingent separated from the Greek line, raised their hands toward the Persians, and surrendered, claiming, in what Herodotus calls with rare editorial dryness, the veriest truth, that they had come to Thermopylae under compulsion and had always been sympathetic to Persia. Xerxes had them branded with the royal mark. The Theban general Leonidas would later be killed by his own countrymen for his role in the collaboration. The surviving Spartans and Thespians retreated to the Kolonos Hill, the small rise behind the main position, and formed a final defensive circle. Their spears had broken. Herodotus records that they fought with their swords until those too were spent or lost. What came next is in Herodotus at 7.225, and it is the most visceral detail in an account full of visceral details. The last defenders fought with their hands and their teeth. Xerxes, watching from his elevated position, recognized that frontal assault on the hill was going to cost more bodies than he was willing to spend. He ordered his archers to finish it from a distance. The barrage that followed was sustained, methodical, and final. In 1939, the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos excavated the Kolonos Hill. He found hundreds of Persian bronze arrowheads, trilobate points of the type the Achaemenid army used, concentrated on the hill's surface. 2,400 years after the battle, the physical evidence of Xerxes' final order lay in the soil exactly where Herodotus had said it would be. The last Greeks at Thermopylae died under an arrow storm that archaeology can still find. The pass was open. The Persian army began to move. The battlefield, when the killing stopped, told its story in numbers. Herodotus records Persian casualties at approximately 20,000 dead across the 3 days of combat. Modern historians approach this figure with appropriate caution. Herodotus is the sole primary source for the specific number, and ancient casualty figures have a well-documented tendency toward inflation, particularly when the narrator is writing about the enemy. What is not seriously disputed is that Persian losses were substantial, that they were disproportionate to Greek losses given the terrain conditions, and that Xerxes himself took steps that only make sense if the real numbers were damaging. He ordered most of his own dead buried. Herodotus records this with evident awareness of its significance. Xerxes left approximately 1,000 Persian bodies visible on the battlefield, covering the rest in hastily dug trenches layered with leaves and soil. And the fleet was approaching. The naval contingent that had been fighting simultaneously at Artemisium was now converging on the army's position. And Xerxes judged that allowing those sailors to see 20,000 Persian dead would not be good for morale. The concealment of casualties to protect the psychological state of one's own forces is a maneuver that military history records across many centuries. That Xerxes felt it necessary tells us something about the true cost of 3 days at the hot gates. Greek casualties, by comparison. Herodotus records that Xerxes later displayed approximately 4,000 Greek bodies to the fleet. This figure encompasses the dead of all 3 days across all contingents: Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, Helots, and any lighter troops not individually counted in Herodotus's main breakdown. The ratio, even accepting the most conservative modern revision of Herodotus's Persian figure, represents a casualty imbalance that the terrain entirely explains. The Greeks held a position where Persian numbers worked against them. The mathematics of the pass held to the end. Then came Xerxes' treatment of Leonidas, which revealed more about what the 3 days had cost the King of Kings psychologically than any casualty figure could. The Persian custom, documented across Herodotus' account of the campaign, was to honor brave enemies. Xerxes had specifically departed from this practice toward enemies he respected. He did not depart from it toward Leonidas. Herodotus records at 9.78 through 79 that Xerxes ordered Leonidas' head cut off and mounted on a stake. But this was a visible and deliberate desecration, a violation of the respect that Persian imperial custom generally extended to fallen opponents. A king so absolutely in command of events that he had punished a sea for misbehaving chose, in the case of one Spartan king, to do something his own tradition counseled against. The Greeks did not forget. Approximately 40 years after the battle, Sparta sent men back to Thermopylae to retrieve what were believed to be Leonidas's remains. They were brought back to Sparta with ceremony. A shrine was built. Annual games were held at Thermopylae in the fallen king's honor. The hero cult that Greek society built around its most significant dead absorbed Leonidas and made him permanent. 3 memorial epitaphs were placed at the battlefield shortly after the fighting, commissioned by the Amphictyonic League. The one attributed to the poet Simonides for the Spartan dead has survived in various translations across 2,500 years. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Simonides wrote a separate epitaph for Megistias the seer, not on commission, but, as Herodotus records at 7.228, for friendship's sake. A man's private grief for a friend who chose not to leave, preserved in stone, outlasting the empire that killed him. The pass was open. The army moved south. Athens was days away. The news from Thermopylae reached the Greek fleet at Artemisium while the naval fighting was still ongoing, and the fleet had been engaged for 3 days simultaneously with the land battle. A coordination that Themistocles' strategy had specifically designed and that the tactical situation had sustained. At Artemisium, the strait between northern Euboea and the mainland, the Greek fleet of approximately 270 triremes had fought 3 days of engagements against a Persian navy that substantially outnumbered it. The first day had gone to the Greeks. 30 Persian ships captured. The subsequent days had been grinding and inconclusive, with both sides suffering serious damage. A Persian squadron attempting to sail around Euboea and emerge behind the Greek fleet was destroyed by storms. The naval contest was expensive for both sides and undecided. When the word arrived that Thermopylae had fallen, carried across the water by a fast dispatch vessel, the Greek fleet had no choice. The entire logic of the dual defense depended on both positions holding simultaneously. With the land route open, the Persian army could march down the coast and threaten any naval position the Greeks occupied. With the Artemisium position abandoned, the Persian fleet could move freely into the Saronic Gulf and threaten the Peloponnese directly. Themistocles ordered the withdrawal. The fleet pulled back toward the island of Salamis. Athens, meanwhile, had been quietly preparing for what Themistocles had believed all along was the most likely outcome. The Delphic oracle, consulted by the Athenians before the campaign, had told them to trust their wooden walls. Themistocles had argued, on over-fierce opposition, that the wooden walls meant the fleet, not the literal wooden walls around the Acropolis. The evacuation he had planned accordingly was now completed. Women, children, the elderly, the household goods of an entire city transported to the islands of Salamis, Aegina, and Troezen across the Saronic Gulf. When the Persian army marched into Attica, they found a city largely empty of the people they had come to subjugate. What they found was not entirely empty. A small group of Athenians, apparently convinced that the oracle's wooden walls referred to a wooden palisade on the Acropolis, had remained to defend the sacred rock. The Persians killed them and burned the Acropolis. The destruction is archaeologically confirmed. It left a layer the Germans later named the Perser's Schutt, the Persian rubble that excavations have identified beneath the classical buildings that replaced what was burned. Xerxes had achieved what he set out to achieve. Athens was sacked, the Acropolis destroyed, the Athenians reduced to refugees on an island watching their city burn. What he had not achieved was the thing the 3 days at Thermopylae had been bought to prevent: the destruction of Greek capacity to resist. The fleet at Salamis was intact. The Athenians were alive. The Peloponnesian army was mobilizing behind the Isthmus of Corinth. Themistocles had one more strategic card to play, and it was the same card Leonidas had played at Thermopylae. Find the narrow place, put the enemy in it, and let the terrain do what numbers cannot. At Salamis in September of 480 BC, in a strait barely wide enough for the Persian fleet to maneuver, the Greek triremes destroyed Xerxes' naval force. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore Herodotus records as his fleet, the supply line and strategic foundation of the entire campaign, was broken in the cramped water. He retreated to Persia, leaving Mardonius with a land army to finish the conquest. The following year, at Plataea, a Greek force under the Spartan regent Pausanias destroyed Mardonius's army. Mardonius was killed. The Persian invasion was over. Thermopylae had cost everything 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians had to give. What it purchased was the 17 days between the pass falling and Salamis being fought. 17 days in which Athens evacuated, the fleet repositioned, though Themistocles put his own choke point strategy into place. Whether that was enough, or whether the Greeks would have managed without those days, historians have debated across centuries. What is not debated is that the invasion ended, Greece remained free, and the price of the pass was paid. Military historians studying Thermopylae have identified a set of principles that the battle demonstrates with unusual clarity. And these principles appear in modern military curricula, not because ancient battles are directly applicable to contemporary warfare, but because the underlying logic doesn't expire. The most visible is terrain as force multiplier. The Greeks at Thermopylae did not fight a larger army. They fought a larger army in a specific place where that army's size was irrelevant. Leonidas did not select Thermopylae despite the Persian numerical advantage. He selected it because of it. The principle that a smaller, better equipped force occupying superior terrain can neutralize the advantages of a numerically dominant attacker has been demonstrated across military history from Thermopylae to Rorke's Drift to the Ai Drang Valley. The specific weapons change. The geometry does not. The second principle is what military theorists call combined arms coordination in reverse. The Greeks at Thermopylae exploited the systematic failure of Persian combined arms. Persian doctrine required archery for suppression, cavalry for flanking, and infantry for the final push. In the pass, the archery was ineffective against bronze armor, the cavalry could not deploy, and the infantry was forced into a frontal fight on a front where their numbers meant nothing. Leonidas had chosen ground that systematically invalidated his opponent's tactical strengths. This is a more sophisticated form of defensive planning than simply dig in and hold. It required detailed analysis of what the enemy was good at and deliberate selection of terrain that made those qualities useless. The third principle, harder to codify but documented by the battle's most significant consequence, is the strategic value of bought time. 3 days at Thermopylae did not win the Persian Wars. The Persian Wars were won at Salamis and Plataea. But Salamis required the fleet to be intact, the Athenians to be alive, and Themistocles to have time to set his trap. Plataea required the surviving Greek army to regroup, re-equip, and march to the confrontation under Spartan command. The question of whether Salamis and Plataea were possible without those 3 days cannot be definitively answered. What can be said is that the 3-day delay was the explicit purpose of the defensive plan, and that Salamis came 17 days after Thermopylae fell, which is consistent with the delay having provided exactly the window that was needed. The broader historical argument that the Greek victory in the Persian Wars preserved the political conditions that allowed Western philosophy, democracy, and scientific inquiry to develop is genuinely contested among historians. Pierre Briand and other scholars of the Achaemenid Empire have argued that this framing overstates both what Persian conquest would have meant for Greek culture and the degree to which Greek culture was uniquely responsible for subsequent Western intellectual development. The argument that Thermopylae saved Western civilization is not a settled historical conclusion. It is a claim that serious historians debate seriously. What is not debated is the immediate consequence. The Greek world remained politically autonomous after the Persian Wars, and the century that followed, the 5th century BC, produced Socrates, Sophocles, Pericles, Thucydides, and the architectural and political experiments of Athens' Golden Age. Whether Persian conquest would have prevented this, altered it, or simply redirected it, is a question that belongs to the philosophy of history rather than its documentation. The pass at Thermopylae has been used as a strategic choke point 4 times in recorded history. In 279 BC, invading Gauls used the Anapaea path to outflank a Greek defense. The same vulnerability, the same solution, the same outcome. In 191 BC, a Roman army defeated the Syrian king Antiochus III at the same pass. And in 1941 CE, Anzac forces held Thermopylae against the Nazi advance long enough to allow the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate to Crete. The same ground, the same logic. The centuries between them make no difference to the geometry. Simonides placed 3 stone epitaphs at Thermopylae within months of the battle, or the Amphictyonic League commissioned 2 of them. The third, for Megistias the seer, Simonides wrote himself, as Herodotus records at 7.228, for friendship's sake. The most enduring of the 3, for the Spartan dead, has been translated differently by every generation that has encountered it, which is itself evidence of how many generations have found it necessary to translate. The Greek, preserved in Herodotus, says roughly that the Spartans lie here, obedient to their laws. The city of Sparta erected a statue of Leonidas. The hero cult established around him persisted for centuries. 40 years after the battle, Sparta retrieved his remains, or what were believed to be his remains, from the battlefield and built him a shrine. Where the Aristodemus story is the moral complexity that sits at the center of the legend and refuses to be resolved into simple heroism. Aristodemus was one of the 300. He contracted severe ophthalmia, an acute eye infection, before the final battle, and was dismissed from the line by Leonidas, along with one other soldier, Eurytus, who had the same condition. Both men were lying sick at Alpinus when the Immortals descended from the mountain. Eurytus ordered his Helot servant to lead him back to the battle, blind. He put on his armor by touch, was led into the fighting, and died with his comrades. Aristodemus did not return. He survived. He came back to Sparta to find that surviving was worse than dying. Herodotus documents what followed at 7.231. No Spartan would speak to him. No one would give him fire. And no one would share a meal with him. He was called, formally and publicly, Aristodemus the Trembler, ho tresas in Greek, a legal designation of cowardice that carried real social consequences. He had left the battle alive, under orders, for a legitimate medical reason, while his comrades died. The logic of Spartan society did not accommodate the distinction. A year later, at the Battle of Plataea, Aristodemus fought with what Herodotus calls suicidal bravery, charging out of the Greek line, breaking formation, attacking with a ferocity that had nothing measured or disciplined about it. He was acknowledged as the most fearless fighter on the field. Herodotus records, without apparent irony, that the Spartans did not award him the prize for valor, because his bravery at Plataea came from a desire to die rather than a desire to win. The Spartans drew a distinction between controlled courage, the courage of men who stand in the line because the law requires it and maintain their formation under pressure, and the recklessness of a man trying to die his way out of shame. Only the first kind counted. This distinction is not a small one. It is the beating heart of what Spartan warrior culture was actually producing. Not men who charge blindly into death, but men who could hold a 20-meter pass for 3 days, execute a rehearsed feigned retreat against the finest troops in the world, and maintain formation under an arrow storm until the last Greek was dead. And the Agage spent 13 years not just making men hard, but making them disciplined, capable of fear and capable of choosing not to act on it, which is a different thing entirely from not feeling it. The cultural afterlife of Thermopylae began with the battle itself. Aeschylus staged the Persians in 472 BC, 8 years after the battle, while veterans still lived. And the Athenian audience who watched it included men who had fought at Salamis. The battle entered political philosophy almost immediately as an example of free men defending their own law against the compulsion of empire. This framing began with Greek writers and has never entirely left Western political discourse. It has also never been ideologically neutral. The Greeks were writing their own history, and they wrote it to their advantage. The specific phrase, "Mullen Labe," come and take them, appears on the insignia of the United States Army Special Forces. The epitaph of Simonides has been quoted by political figures across 2.5 millennia. In contexts the Spartans would not have recognized and might not have approved. Benjamin Franklin referenced the men of Thermopylae. Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the example of those who choose principle over survival. The battle has been claimed by philosophies ranging from classical democracy to modern authoritarianism, which tells us less about Thermopylae than it does about the universal human appetite for a story where a small group stood against overwhelming force and made that stand mean something. What remains, stripped of the uses history has made of it, new is this: 700 Thespians whose city would burn regardless, 300 Spartans under a 60-year-old king who had read his own death in an oracle's prophecy, and a seer named Megistius who sent his son away and stayed himself because a friend was there and he did not want him to die alone. The hot springs still flow at Thermopylae. A modern statue of Leonidas stands on the eastern side of the motorway that follows the ancient shoreline. Across the road, at the top of a small hill, the words of Simonides are carved in stone. The original battlefield lies 20 meters below the surface of Greek farmland, buried under the sediment of 2,500 years, still holding in its soil the bronze arrowheads of the final barrage. The past doesn't exist anymore. The lesson never stopped being true. 7,000 men, now 120,000 to 300,000 opponents, depending on which historians you follow and how much weight you give to the logistical evidence. 3 days of combat in a pass so narrow that numbers became irrelevant. Herodotus records 20,000 Persian dead. Modern scholars treat this figure as Herodotus's estimate rather than a verified count. And note that the concealment of most of the bodies, Xerxes ordered them buried before the fleet arrived, made accurate accounting impossible even at the time. What is not in serious dispute is the casualty ratio, which the terrain explains completely. The Greeks inflicted losses that their numbers alone could never have produced, because they fought in the one place where their numbers didn't matter. The 3 days at Thermopylae bought what Themistocles needed. They bought the time for the fleet to reposition at Salamis, for Athens to complete its evacuation, for the trap at the strait to be prepared and baited. Whether those specific 17 days were the difference between Greek survival and Greek conquest is a question historians have argued across centuries without resolution. What they agree on is that Salamis was fought with the Greek fleet intact and the Athenians alive, and that Plataea was fought with a Greek army that had not been defeated in the field. The pass held long enough for those facts to be possible. The men who made those facts possible are mostly unnamed. The 700 Thespians who chose to die in a pass from which their city could not be saved regardless, whose commander Demophilus is named once in Herodotus and then disappears, are remembered as footnotes to a story about Spartans. The Helots who died beside their Spartan masters are not named at all. History keeps the story. It loses the people. What remains documented is the principle. Terrain, chosen deliberately and used intelligently, can rewrite the mathematics of force. A smaller force, standing in the right place, can make an opponent's numbers irrelevant. The choice of ground is the first tactical decision, and at Thermopylae, it was the only one that mattered. Modern military academies include Thermopylae in their curricula, not because bronze spears and hoplite armor have any application to contemporary warfare, because the underlying logic, find the narrow ground, strip the enemy of their advantages, make your position cost more to take than it's worth, doesn't expire with the weapons that demonstrated it. Every subsequent generation has had to relearn this principle, sometimes at great cost, because each generation forgets it again. The pass is always available to demonstrate it once more. The statue of Leonidas stands by the motorway at Thermopylae, looking north toward the direction from which the Persian army came. Behind him, the hot springs still run. The epitaph is still carved in the stone of the hill. The arrowheads are still in the earth of Kolonos, the way Marinados found them in 1939, and the way they will be found again if the earth is turned. A king of 60 went to a mountain pass with 300 men and dismissed most of his army when the end was certain, and stayed with what remained. Herodotus gives us two explanations. The two explanations together don't fully account for it. Some decisions are made at the intersection of duty and calculation, and something that doesn't reduce to either. The thing that drives a man to send his son to safety and stay himself, or to lead men with spears into wider ground because dying is already settled, and what remains is the question of how much it costs. That question doesn't have a historical period. It just keeps getting asked. The bronze arrowheads in the hill at Thermopylae are the answer one generation gave, and they are still there. As 20 meters below the place where the motorway runs, and the hot springs steam, and the epitaph waits for whoever needs to read it next.